Hi, inner stories, outer worlds, inner stories. Today, we are talking about the villain of the 9 in the Enneagram, the head center in human design, the invisible destroyer, which I like to refer to more colloquially as the nothing. For those of you children of the 80s or who have heard of the NeverEnding Story, you will know what I am talking about when I mention the nothing. This is an interesting villain. We're going to be looking at it particularly through the lens of the movie Tomorrowland, which many of you may not have seen. It was a one-off George Clooney movie. Tomorrowland is a brilliant movie. It's one that I would really encourage people to say because it really does convey the very esoteric nature of the invisible destroyer. But we're also going to be looking at it through the original villain, which is the nothing from Michael Ende's The NeverEnding Story, also the movie. Here we go. The arc of the invisible destroyer. The arc of the invisible destroyer is, when I say it's the head center and it's the 9 in the Enneagram, we are sitting here at really very kind of esoteric and almost what feels like intangible things when we come to this arc. Addiction sits in this arc, right, as the covert form. And one of the best ways that I can describe this is that what if the greatest villain isn't a monster, but it's the feeling that nothing matters, that the world is broken beyond repair and it's your job to protect yourself by disengaging from it. That is the invisible destroyer. It says, there's no hope. There's nothing left for me here. I don't believe I have any power, and so I'm going to totally disengage from my power. You are in an escapist mentality entirely. The archetype is truly about the annihilation by fragmentation, detachment, and addiction. It is rooted in the infinite potential that we have as humans, but without grounding it, it destroys rather than creates. The invisible destroyer is the villain. The architect, the ultimate creator, is the legend. All right, so in the movie, Gmork plays a very similar role than he does in the book. The book is very different. It has so many more adventures, so many more stories. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a wonderful story. But in the movie, we see that Gmork tries to describe to Atreyu what the nothing is. He does the same thing in a book, but he does it in a very different way. Gmork, the wolf, the werewolf, is telling Atreyu that everybody is going to go into the nothing. And when they go into the nothing, they are no longer themselves. They are no longer the character in Fantastica, which is what it's called here, or Fantasia. They are going to be changed, that they are going to become servants of the nothing when they go into the nothing. And Atreyu's like, well, what am I going to become once I go into the nothing? This is how Gmork answers. You ask me what you will be there, but what are you here? What are you creatures of Fantastica? Dreams, poetic inventions, characters in a never-ending story. Do you think you're real? Well, yes, here in your world, you are. But when you've been through the nothing, you won't be real anymore. You'll be unrecognizable. And you will be in another world. In that world, you Fantasticans won't be anything like yourselves. You will bring delusion and madness into the human world. Tell me, Sonny, what do you suppose will become of all the Spook City folk? Spook City doesn't appear in the movie. Spook City is ghosts, vampires, that whole world that all of them come from. What do you suppose will become of all the Spook City folk who have jumped into the nothing? I don't know, Atreyu stammered. They will become delusions in the minds of human beings. Fears where there is nothing to fear. Desire for vain, hurtful things. Despairing thoughts where there is no reason to despair. All of us? Asked Atreyu in horror. No, said Gmork. There are many kinds of delusion. According to what you are here, ugly or beautiful, stupid or clever, you will become ugly or beautiful, stupid or clever lies. What about me? Atreyu asked. What will I be? Gmork grinned. I won't tell you that. You'll see. Or rather, you won't see because you won't be yourself anymore. Atreyu stared at the werewolf with wide open eyes, and Gmork went on. That's why humans hate Fantastica and everything that comes from here. They want to destroy it. And they don't realize that by destroying it, they multiply the lies that keep flooding the human world. For these lies are nothing other than creatures of Fantastica who have ceased to be themselves and survive only as living corpses, poisoning the souls of men with their fetid smell, but humans don't know it. Isn't that a good joke? I could go on. So the idea is that when we have the experience of the nothing, The invisible destroyer asks us to become detached from our power. Fantasia is a world that exists of human imagination, of the stories, of the neighborhood of worlds, places that I've been, that I've dreamt of. But in the most point, that's why we have fan fiction. We have entire worlds that are created. And if the characters are strong enough and the realization is strong enough, it is a land in Fantasia and our own collective imagination, our collective creative consciousness. And what that does is that then makes it so that we can build on that world. But we have to recognize that the nature of the mind is generative. What I mean by that is that we have to recognize that if we don't use our imagination to create and to bring into the world and recognize that our imagination has so much power, that we have the capability of doing so much inside of us, and that our imagination brings things to life, whether we want it or not, then what happens is our imagination is then turned against us. And we want to escape, and we don't recognize our power, and it becomes lies. Everything that's in our imagination becomes lies. It starts to get worked against us. That's the entire inner villain system. That's why this is so brilliant. The entire inner villain system is based on this concept of the fact that the stories that we create, the strategies and beliefs that we create inside our own minds, and inside, especially if we've created them when we're younger, we take those with us and we live in that world, and that becomes the lie and the principle that we base our life on. So if you don't know who I am and you've made it this far, I'm Kristina Wiltsee, and I am a life alchemist, which means that my job is to help everybody change their perspective, get rid of their old strategies, get rid of their own beliefs, and fully find their core self, to come through their arcs in all 9 of these villains. We all have all 9 of them. Some of them are a lot more prevalent than others. To come through the arc in all 9 of these villains and make it so that we become our inner legend. And I do it in this particular channel through the lens of characters in popular movies that people have an understanding of, because that's one of the ways that we can shift our perspective, is when we see it outside. When we see it outside, we're able to see it in a different way. Here are the different personas of the nothing, which is really important to recognize as we move through this arc. Every single one of these arcs have different personas, different stages that they exist at, and this is what it is for the nothing. The invisible destroyer is the pinnacle villain of this arc. The invisible destroyer is the nothing. It is pure nihilism and destruction. It basically looks to destroy anything that is progress, anything that is anything else. It is a person who would just be in the pinnacle of their avoidance. They believe that the world is so bad, and they use their imagination to create the worst version of the world inside their head, and then they react to the real world in a version of that. I have a podcast called This Spiritual Fix, and a friend of mine, my co-host on there, Anna Stromquist, she was talking to me. She was like, what's the worst version of each of these, and what does it actually practically look like? And we said the worst version of the nothing is when you think that the world is so awful that you just disappear. You have a family, you have responsibilities, you have things that you can create in the world, and you let your delusions become so strong that you just leave. And you just go, maybe you go off into the woods for 10 months and you never do anything. That is this nothing. It is destructive in its inaction and its addiction to inaction. That is the pinnacle villain of this arc. The next one, the successful antagonist, which is the version of the persecutor of this particular arc. It's a subtype of the villain work and of the actual villain, is the questioner. The questioner is that person who is always going to question whether or not what is the best thing that we can be doing in this particular situation for this particular thing? And they question for so long, they never do anything. It's a bit like analysis paralysis, but instead of spending all their time in research, they're spending all their time in questioning whether or not this is actually the right way to go forward. So many people can get stuck in that. The next one down is the wounded child, which is the overwhelmed. This is very likely a person who is incredibly sensitive to the world. They are incredibly sensitive to their own mortality. They're incredibly sensitive to, and they want to maybe escape into the intellect or into trying to research something, or they want to escape into questions. And they're so overwhelmed by everything around them that they create a strategy that says that I need to escape. I want to escape. I need to get out of this world because I don't know anything else that's happening. This brings up the fact that the complex villains, which are the 7, 8, and 9, which are Loki, if you go back and look at that video, which is the hungry shapeshifter, the righteous bully, which we haven't done yet. That will be the next video. The righteous bully, which is the Thanos, and the invisible destroyer, are all more complex because they're combinations of the earlier villains. This one is a combination of the 5 and the 6. The 5 is the evasive expert who is going to shut off all their emotions in favor of being a deep researcher, and the 6 who is the divisive immortal, who is terrified of death and who is terrified of their own mortality and therefore, and how awful the world is. And so you can see that in the 9 here, especially with the overwhelmed. They may be overwhelmed with the nature of life and why are they here, and doing everything they can to try and question and come up with a strategy to escape as much as possible. The covert villain in this form is the addict. Some people would say, well, the addict, how is that covert? Because it's covert because they've chosen a strategy that allows them to escape, but you can't even see all the things that preceded it. That's why it's covert. It's like the other coverts are the people pleaser and the obedient critic, the envious and the vain controller, or the romantic in the eternal child. Those are all versions of eternal. The faithful and the divisive immortal. All of those are versions of coverts in all of these other arcs. And sometimes you're like, how does that even connect to the divisive immortal? That's the brilliance of this, is that you can start to recognize that the addiction is it's a late stage of a strategy that makes it so that you're so far away from understanding the actual strategy that you're just like, I'm an addict and I don't know why. There are obviously a lot of different reasons for addiction. And for those of you who are watching this who are in recovery, I would encourage you to test this as you want. A lot of the way that I actually move people through this arc is by using the 12 steps. So I'd encourage you to, if this video stirs up anything for you, that you go back to those reliable resources in the 12 steps. The hero of this arc is the embodied. And what I mean by embodied, sensual pleasure, things that it makes it so that you actually want to realize your full potential in your human body and in your human form. What I mean by embodied, it's not just being in your physical body. That's more divisive immortal. It goes beyond that in the sense that you've integrated your emotional side, your need for research, and you've integrated the fact that you have come to grips with death. And that's why the 12 steps are such a useful part of this, because realizing that you don't have control and yet continuing to operate in the world is where we're trying to go with this. That's why the embodied is the hero of this, because you are still operating in the world despite the fear of the world, or however else you view the world. The architect is the legend of this arc because the architect is the ultimate creator. We move from the villain, which is destroying, to the architect, which is creating. People who they've deconditioned the center as in human design, or they've come through this arc, they have just such a brilliant view of how they can create in the world, and they've come into a different space with how they choose to create. They understand the value and the actual role that they have in creating fantasia in their own imagination. There's so much about imagination in this. They actually recognize that their imagination has power, and then they use their imagination wisely. They don't feed catastrophic thoughts within their minds. They use their imagination widely, and then they actually create it in the world. Just like at the end of the NeverEnding Story, when Bastian recognizes that he is actually, when he names Moonchild, if anyone was wondering what that says, if he names the childlike empress, he admits that he has power in the world, that his imagination has power. And then he's able to bring Falkor into the real world, right? And we recognize that's when Bastian actually recognizes the power that he has, because Bastian exists in the nothing. He's experienced this loss. He's experienced the fact that he doesn't feel as if he needs to grow up and get rid of his imagination. And instead of doing what the nothing wants you to do, which is to grow up and get rid of your imagination, it's saying you have power in your imagination. Use it as the tool it's meant to be used as.
Bastian. Why don't you do what you dream, Bastian?
All right, so Tomorrowland. For those of you who have seen Tomorrowland, it's an absolutely brilliant movie. It makes me so sad that it wasn't actually more popular because of the fact that it is so brilliant.
Well, when I was a kid, the future was different.
Tomorrowland, the basic premise of Tomorrowland, and spoilers if you haven't seen this, but I really recommend that you see this, is that there existed this world called Tomorrowland, which brought forth all the greatest thinkers, all the greatest creators in the world. It doesn't have to be geniuses, right? It could be people who are great artists, who can be geniuses at being artists. It's people who are great creators and great thinkers and have hope. They bring hope into everything that they do. They know that the world can be a better place. That is what Tomorrowland did. It was an alternate universe that lived directly besides our universe. And it was so brilliant because it was trying to pull in, it was honestly a little bit exclusive, so maybe not the best idea in that case, and they did kind of maintain that, but they were trying to pull forth and bring invitations to all the greatest thinkers, bring them into this world and have them create in this perfect paradise in which everything was created for them, everything was given to them. It's effectively a world of imagination that lives directly next to us. They are given free rein for their imaginations to do whatever they want. And then something happens. Nix was the governor of Tomorrowland, and he created a machine that was meant to predict the end of the world. And instead of using that as a way to recognize that Tomorrowland needed to exist, he shut down all the gates to Tomorrowland. He basically made it so no one could go there. He kicked everybody out and then got ready for the end of the world. The main character has the capacity for hope in her mind. She recognizes that everything is awful in the world and has this sense of dread that everything's going to be awful, but she ignores it and she keeps creating. She meets George Clooney's character, who was originally invited into Tomorrowland and can kind of act as the guide to get her back into Tomorrowland. But the moment that they meet, George Clooney's character has been watching the end of the world, the ticker, the countdown for the end of the world. And when she appears in front of his counter and she starts talking about how beautiful the world could be, the timer for the doomsday, which is like set a month in advance of when the movie takes place, it disappears. The end of the world doesn't happen. The hope of one person and the creativity of one person is capable of changing the timer. And they start to recognize once they get back to Tomorrowland and they're trying to fight Nix, who is convinced that the world is not worth saving. He is the representation of the nothing. They start to realize that not only is this sensor that's sensing the end of the world, sensing when the world is going to be bad, it's also transmitting the end of the world. It's transmitting those lies that we just talked about in the nothing, in the NeverEnding Story. It's transmitting lies that say it's so bad, you need to believe it's so bad and there is no hope, and thus creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So why aren't you telling anyone? The whole planet is gonna die and you're just sitting here?
We're not gonna die.
They try and convince Nix that, in fact, this is not the way that it needs to be. They're trying to convince Nix that they need to re-let people back into Tomorrowland because Tomorrowland is the representation of the imagination and the architect. And eventually they defeat him and they're capable, and then they invite everybody back in. So we can see that the villain here doesn't show up as a person, it's a number of representations. The Invisible Destroyer is Governor Nix. He's played by Hugh Laurie, who does a great job. He's so convinced that humanity won't change that he gives up and feeds the destructive signal out.
In every moment, there is the possibility of a better future, but you people won't believe it.
And he represents despair dressed as realism. That's a classic. The questioner in this one is society itself. It's absorbing and echoing the doom signal without resistance. It keeps questioning whether or not it's worth actually saving, right? And people who stop asking what's possible and instead asks, what's the point, right? So you can see that that's the representation of the questioner in this story. The overwhelmed is Frank Walker, who is George Clooney's character as a child. His dream is crushed and he internalizes his rejection and he just works to protect himself, right? So when you get to the movie, he's got all of these technologies because he's a great creator in this. He's an inventor. He's created all of these technologies to defend himself because that is the classic of what the overwhelmed will do. The addict in this is, again, humanity that's addicted to doom scrolling, end times thinking, resignation. It's never going to get any better. And it's also a representation of Frank and how hard it is for him to retreat out of the space of thinking that he's addicted to isolation and not being with anybody. It's like he wants to pull back from society and not actually engage, despite the fact that he's completely capable of doing it. The embodied is Casey. Casey is the protagonist. She refuses to believe that the future is fixed, and she is helped by an android in this situation who's a little girl who is effectively acting as an instigator. She's the one who creates the inciting incident that gives the pin that will give Casey a preview of Tomorrowland, who's trying to keep recruiting people who are creative, who are architects already. She never stopped with her programming as an android, and she's convinced of doing that. So the hero is Casey. She's the protagonist, and she refuses to believe that the future is fixed. She refuses to believe that she never wants to give up hope.
Even the teeniest of actions could change the future.
And by doing that, she's embodied in the world, and she's recognizing that the world is bleak, but she also embodies everything that exists within her and within her own imagination. And then the architect is Casey and Frank together when they reboot Tomorrowland, after they've destroyed Governor Nix, and after they've destroyed the transmitter that says that the world is going into an awful place. So what is the conclusion of all of this? If you resonate with this arc, your job is to recognize that you are ultimately a creator and that hope has lost and left you. And so you too can invite your own Tomorrowland back into your world. You too can become the Bastion from the NeverEnding Story. You too can do anything that you need to do. You can be like Jobu Tupaki in Everything Everywhere All at Once and actually decide that yes, it is very bleak, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It doesn't mean that it's not worth living. How can we become embodied in architect, and how can we recognize our job, the job of imagination, the gift of imagination, and how do we bring it into the world to actually become creators? So if you have any questions, as always, let me know. I'm really trying to grow this channel as much as possible. I've gotten good feedback. So if you guys are able to like, subscribe, you can hit the like button, you can hit the subscribe button and pass us on to other people. That would be absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you have a wonderful day filled with imagination.